right, folks, welcome back. Our next faculty presenter is Pratap Tokekar. He's an assistant professor in computer science. Pratap.
Thanks, Yancy, for first organizing the symposium. It's great to be back in person. We did this virtually last year. It's always great to see faces, and hopefully we'll continue seeing people in person soon. I'm Pratap Tokekar. I'm a faculty in the computer science department. I'm an assistant professor. I'm going to talk about the work that my group has been doing on risk-aware multi-robot coordination. My group works on puts on two hats. If we put on our algorithmic hat and we study like foundational problems in multi-robot coordination, and then we also put on our field robotics hat, actually build systems and deploy these systems in the real world. Oftentimes working with stakeholders in other areas like environmental monitoring, in agriculture, in civil infrastructure inspection, and so on. Right. The core research question that we are addressing in my group really is how do we get a team of robots, a team of heterogeneous robots, to plan their actions, to plan their paths, to coordinate their actions, to gather interesting data from the wild. Right? So there are essentially like three parts to this. How do we quantify what interesting data means? How do we get a team of heterogeneous robots? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then ultimately, this is a team, right? So underlying all of this is aspects of multi-robot coordination. How do we get these robots to play nicely with each other? So in this, before I sort of go into the technical portion of the talk, I wanted to just give an overview of the kinds of application that we've been working on for a few years. One area that we've been very active over the past few years is precision agriculture. Right? So the goal here really is to do agriculture in a data-driven fashion. So use robots like aerial robots as well as ground robots that are instrumented with a variety of scientific sensors to go out in the field and gather relevant data from the field, from a specific field, that then you can use to, for example, build models of what's happening in the field, use that to use your machine learning algorithm, your AI techniques to essentially learn the health status of your farm and to predict relevant quantities in the future, right? So relevant, so predict things like what's the yield going to be in 3 months' time? Do I need to apply fertilizer in this specific location? How much fertilizer should I apply, and so on? And the role of the robots here is to gather data that can aid such decision making, right? We've also been working on infrastructure inspection. And again, the idea here is to do help human inspectors by using robots, in this case, aerial robots that are equipped with high resolution cameras to gather, in this case, visual data that can then be used to identify, for example, defects on a bridge, right? So you can get close to the field, close to the bridge, and you can identify visual defects. Are there cracks? Is there corrosion? Is there some part that's missing? Is there a bolt that's loose, and so on? And instead of sending human inspectors in these dangerous conditions, that may also require you to either shut down a bridge or take a hefty insurance. At least a routine inspection can be, we can use aerial robots to go gather data at an arm's length. And we've been working on how do we improve the autonomy stack to enable this kind of inspection, in particular, focusing on how do we carefully plan the routes of these aerial robots to gather visual data for a bridge. And we've also been working with our partners in environmental sciences. So this was a project that recently concluded where we were using a team of aerial as well as robotic boats for monitoring marine environments. And the goal here was to use aerial robots as scouts. So robots that can go out, that are instrumented with the right type of sensors, to go scout for potential hazards in the environment. So for example, if there is a chemical leak, you can use your aerial robot to quickly scan the area and build a map of what's happening, what's the extent of the hazard, where's the hazard concentrated, and then use a robotic boat that can go to the most interesting locations and collect physical samples, right? So you use aerial robots for scouting and robotic boats for sampling, and these two robots then work well with each other. Right? And we looked at sort of these kind of coordination problem. How do we quickly scan an area? How do we build a map of hazardous quantity that may be spatially and temporally varying? How do we actively choose where to obtain measurements from, and so on and so forth. Right? And recently, we have a new collaboration with our partners in the Army Research Lab as part of the Artemis initiative. As part of this initiative, we are looking at a few different things, but relevant to this talk, we are looking at how do we get a team of aerial and ground robots to cooperatively execute long duration missions, right? And the goal here is to enable missions in the order of 72 hours, right? So 3 days, far beyond the battery lifetime of individual robots. So the vision here is to have several robots, aerial and ground, that can be released in the environment that are sort of carrying out the monitoring mission. As they run out of charge, they go back to the base station, to the charging station, new robots take their place, and so on and so forth. So here you have to take into account sort of mission objectives. So you may have specific points or areas that need to be monitored, and they may have their own priorities, but also the health of individual platforms that you have over a long period of time. Right? So let's dive a little bit deeper into one specific example of a mission here. So here is a very simple mission, right? Let's say you have a bunch of points of interest in some environment, and your goal is to basically just go to these locations and gather data. So in this case, let's say you're just going and taking pictures, high resolution pictures at these specific locations, right? So now if you want to plan a path for your aerial vehicle, the simplest question that you can ask is, can we find a shortest route that can visit all of these points of interest, right? So let's say you're minimizing the total time to visit all of these points of interest, right? So this, if you're familiar with like operations research or computer science literature, this is nothing but a variant of the traveling salesperson problem. It's a very commonly used framework for modeling these kinds of problems. You just want to find the right order in which to visit all of these points. So sort of famous problem has been around for many, many years. There's several both sort of theoretically sound as well as practical solutions for this kind of problems. But there are several twists that show up when we want to use physical robots to carry out missions like this, right? The most important of that all is the robots that we are using, aerial robots, may have limited battery capacity. So they may not have enough capacity to execute the entire length of the mission, right? So it's there now you can change your problem a little bit and say, okay, let's find a path, a route that's going to visit most number of points in the environment. And that's again a very well-studied problem. It's a dual of TSP. Several algorithms exist for this kind of problem. But as I mentioned initially, we are interested in exploiting heterogeneity in the team of robots, right? So something that we've been investigating is if we know that we are going to have aerial as well as ground robots in an environment, can we use the ground robots to help extend the operating capacity of aerial robots, right? So here's what you're seeing here is an aerial robot that's autonomously landing on this ground robot, the ClearPath Husky. And the goal here is to use the ground robot both as a mobile recharging station. So as the aerial robot lands on the ground robot, the ground robot can recharge the aerial robot. And that's actually something that ARL has been investigating as part of their collaborative power redistribution initiative within ARL. So looking at specific mechanisms to enable transfer of power from ground vehicles to aerial vehicles. But then we can also use the ground robot as a mule, right? Because the aerial robot can then hitch a ride on the ground robot and take it to the next deployment location. So now we have to carefully plan, when do you land on the ground robot? Where do you rendezvous to land on the ground robot? You may have sort of several aerial and ground robots. So now this becomes a resource allocation problem that you need to worry about the schedule and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of problems that we've been looking at. So we call this symbiotic planning, and this is just an example of a result that we had a few years back now. So on the left is your standard route with just an aerial robot that's visiting the most number of points within its battery capacity. On the right is what you are getting with a UAV and ground robot system. So the red parts are where the UAV is flying by itself. The dashed blue lines are where it's hitching a ride on on the ground robot. And you can sort of see that we can visit a larger number of points that are also spatially spread out. And we can also give some nice theoretical performance guarantees of our algorithm, right? And then we've applied this, we've extended this over the years in several ways. This is primarily the work of my PhD student, Kevin Yu, who is now finished his PhD. And this is an example where it's a long, it's a snippet from a long video where it was landing autonomously. We didn't have a recharging station at that point. So recharging here meant that Kevin went in and swapped the batteries with a fresh one and then continued. But the nice thing is here, we can take into account parameters like how much time does it take for you to swap out one battery with the other and so on and so forth. So there's like several other parameters that we take into account in the algorithm, the relative speeds, the traversability of the ground vehicle. We also sort of look into situations where you may have a hybrid UAV that can operate both in the fixed wing mode, where it's sort of more energy efficient, as well as a multi-rotor mode where it can vertically take off and land, and then like a whole bunch of other parameters that are part of our optimization. Right. A few videos, I'm going to skip through them. So we had this nice algorithm and we published a few papers and we did some proof of concept deployments, and like things seem to work well for the most part, but not always, right? I don't have sort of videos here, but often things fail. And especially when you deploy sort of robots in the wild, things don't go according to plan. And sort of often times the issue is that there is a mismatch in what we model when we run our algorithms versus what we actually encounter in practice, right? And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit in the rest of my time, is the work that we are doing in so hopefully trying to bridge the gap between like the algorithm development and robustness in the field, right? So how do we get teams of robots to sort of do this kind of coordination, air-ground coordination, multi-robot coordination, but not only can we prove nice thing about the performance of the algorithms in theory, but we also see that reflected in practice, right? So let me do an exercise. It's a nice thing about being in person here, so we can be a little bit interactive. So I'm going to attempt to do that, right? So here's a very simple question for you. Okay. So let's say we have some planner, and this planner is giving us two options. So it's giving us path A and path B. And sort of this uncertainty involved, etc. So what the planner is telling me, and the only thing that the planner is telling me is path A, if you choose path A, on an average is going to take you 20 minutes to get to the destination, right? And then it's giving me path B, and it's saying on an average is going to take you 25 minutes to get to the destination. So I'm going to ask you a very silly question, right? Given just this information, how many of you would choose path A over path B? Let's do a show of hands. Pretty much the entire audience, right? Now let's say I give you some more information, right? So path A on an average takes 20 minutes, but the 20 minutes number comes from the fact that 50% of the times path A is going to take only 5 minutes. So you get really lucky and it only takes you 5 minutes to get to the destination. But the other 50% of the times you get unlucky and it's going to take you 35 minutes. And hopefully if I've done my math right, on an average it's still 20 minutes. Whereas on path B, whether you're lucky or unlucky, it's only going to take you either 24 or 26 minutes. On an average it's still 25 minutes. So let me ask you the same question again. Given this additional piece of information, how many of you would choose path A over path B? I see a few hands up there. Like the first thing I want to point out is there's no correct answer here. And in fact, that's actually one of the two takeaways I want to make over here, right? So the first takeaway is if we care about performance for a specific run, then we perhaps need to go beyond just expected case analysis. So expectation or sort of taking the average over probability distribution is a very, very common way of handling uncertainty. And we have sort of several nice algorithmic ways of dealing with expectation. A lot of the reinforcement learning literature, for example, that you see sort of always uses expectation as the objective. It's a very common technique to handle uncertainty. But expectation can be brittle. Sort of hidden behind that number is actually the actual outcome distribution of outcomes. And there are scenarios where we need to pay attention to what that actual distribution is and go beyond just the expectation if we care specifically about the performance in the field, right? The alternative that's often used is sort of do worst case optimization. So you look at the worst case scenario, but sometimes that can be very conservative, right? Because the worst case might be a specific scenario and the probability of that happening might be very, very low. But if you're optimizing for that, you might end up with very conservative plans. Right. So the two things that I want to argue here are that we need to incorporate risk as part of our optimization, not always, but in many cases, as a way of bridging the gap between what we see in simulation or in theory and what we see in practice. And the second point is that risk in some sense is arguably subjective, right? So your risk tolerance may differ from my risk tolerance, right? And we saw that in the second question in a very unscientific experiment. Some of you still preferred path A, some of you preferred path B with that additional information. That's because our respective risk tolerance levels are different. So what that means from a planning perspective is perhaps the way to handle risk is to give the user a knob that they can tune up or down depending on their risk tolerance preferences, right? So in some cases, you may tune it up and find a conservative plan. In some cases, you may tune it down and find a more risk neutral plan, right? So that's the work that my group is really interested in, and we've been looking at this in several ways. I'm not going to go into all the details of the work that we are doing on risk-aware coordination, but I would really love to chat with you about the details of some of this and some ideas that we have for the future. But let me just give you a flavor of the kind of problems that we've looked at, right? So the first thing is like, how do we even measure risk? Expectation is a very sort of straightforward mathematical definition. Risk, there are several options available, and they all have their respective advantages and disadvantages. We've looked at a few of these. In particular, we've looked at something called conditional value at risk, and then we have some recent work on chance constraint optimization, and I'll talk a little bit about both of these. Right? So this is the same coordination problem with aerial and ground robots. Aerial robots have limited energy. This time what we are saying is we have stochasticity as part of our model. And let's say in this case, the stochasticity shows up because our energy consumption of the aerial vehicle has a probability distribution, right? And let's assume for now we know the probability distribution. And so now what I want to do is I still want to find a route for my UAV and UGV to do this kind of long-term mission. They still need to rendezvous and we need to figure out where to rendezvous, etc. And I still want to minimize the total time. But now I'm going to add an extra layer on top and say that because things are stochastic, minimize the total travel time while ensuring that the probability that things go well is above some user-defined tolerance value, right? And in this case, let's say it's the probability that you run out of charge is above user-defined threshold, right? So now we have this uncertainty that shows up. So again, I'll skip through the details, but as you add sort of uncertainty, things become nasty mathematically, sort of much harder problem to solve now. We have some sort of encouraging results. In particular, we show that we can, in some sense, decouple the problem. So first, find your canonical routes or representative routes, assuming things are deterministic. And then use these deterministic routes and then send it to a refinement algorithm that's now going to consider the uncertainty and is going to refine the route while taking into account the uncertainty that you have and ensuring that the probability of success is at least whatever the user-defined threshold is, right? And the refinement here is done through a tool called constrained Markov decision process. If you're familiar with MDPs, this is the constrained version of that, where you are not only sort of minimizing the expected mission time, which is what a regular MDP would be, but you add that extra constraint saying the probability of mission success is above some user-defined threshold. So harder problem to solve, but with some decoupling and sort of doing this hopefully iteratively, which we haven't done yet, but at least the decoupling part, we can show that it works fairly well. A few representative results, I'll skip through that. The nice thing, as I said here, is we give the user the choice of being risk neutral or aggressive or conservative. So the user can bump up or down the risk tolerance level. And you sort of see this in these three figures here. On the left is where the user is choosing to be very, very conservative. Without sort of going into the details, you can just see that the path is more complicated. It's longer path, just because here what happens is because you are conservative, the robots are going to rendezvous often because you don't want to take the risk of running out of charge. On the other extreme, this is where you say it's okay if you fail 50% of the times, right? So obviously this is an extreme example just to illustrate the point, but you will see the path here is shorter. There are fewer rendezvous because you're sort of giving the robots more flexibility to fail. And then we can sort of quantify what's the extra overhead that you get as a function of the more or less risk that you are taking, and sort of do more of a system analysis. Right. This customary figure to show that ours work better than the baselines. Like we don't need to go into the details here. But this was for a single aerial and single ground robot. I think the more interesting version of the problem is when we have several robots and we have perhaps redundancy in the team of robots. This is where I think we can really see interesting behavior come out of this risk-aware optimization. So this is a version where we studied where we have a bunch of robots and they have a bunch of destinations that they need to go to. But as you'll see in the figure, that we have more vehicles than destination. Right? I'm sort of showing a scenario where they are operating on a street network, but you can imagine robots operating in warehouses and sort of more controlled environments like that. But we have more robots than destinations. Obviously, we have redundancy in the team of robots. Right. The specific sort of interesting problems that we looked at here is where each robot. So here we are sort of solving two problems here because we have redundant assignments that we can make. How do we do this assignment in a way to manage this risk performance trade-off? But also for each robot, they can choose to take a more aggressive path and a less aggressive path. So the overarching idea here, essentially, if you want to draw an analogy to the stock portfolio optimization, it's a terrible time to be sort of drawing inspiration from stock markets, but that's fine. But just like you can bundle together stocks that are high risk, high reward, and low risk, low reward, the idea here is to do similar things, but with plans for a team of robots. So you have some plans that are high risk, high reward, some plans that are low risk, low reward, but by bundling them together in a good way, you can achieve a sweet spot of the performance versus risk Pareto curve that you are on. So here we specifically use something called as conditional value at risk, which is a metric that's commonly used in the financial stock portfolio optimization. We have an anytime algorithm where we can give guarantees of how close we get to the optimal solution as a function of the number of iterations we run for the algorithm, which is sort of also another aspect to consider here, because you may have a very good metric that captures risk perfectly, but if it's going to take you an incredible amount of time to compute that, that's not really going to be useful. If I have a crappier algorithm that I can run more often, perhaps that's going to be more robust in totality than the other one. So, but the nice thing here is we have this anytime flavor to the algorithm. Without going into the details, the results from the empirical point of view are also encouraging. You can see as here in this figure, going from bottom to top, you are asking the robots to become more and more conservative, and we sort of see that in the actual empirical distributions that we see. And then sort of we have sort of several improvements of the algorithm, in particular, looking at how often do you need to replan as uncertainty gets revealed to you and so on. Right. All right. So just to conclude, I'm really excited about this sort of notion of risk. By no means is this the first attempt at incorporating risk in multi-robot coordination. The long history of looking at nuanced notions of risk. But I think there's a lot more work that can be done. I'm excited to contribute to that, and so I would love to chat with you if you have thoughts on that, or if you have sort of suggestions for interesting risk-aware problems that we can look at. With that, I'm going to thank you, and I think we're going to do questions if there's any, or I'll chat with you during the break. Thank you.
We can take one question while we have the next presenter come up and set up. Pratap, if you don't mind moving to that podium. Any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah, so we have not, but that's actually one of the directions that we have to. I was at ICRA last week and I was talking to someone who also on risk-aware coordination, and she told me about a nice result that they have in the pipeline showing exactly that, which is what can change the risk. I think the really cool problem in the space is where you can perhaps learn what the risk tolerance should be as a function of the context in which you are in. If you're in a cluttered environment, you want to be more open environment, you want to learn. I think it's interesting, but we don't.